Welcome to History of the Middle East with Dr. Brovkin. We continue with the Russian-Turkish War or Russian-Ottoman War of 1877-78, which is one of the most important wars in 19th century Europe and Middle East. Now, just briefly to remind you where we are, in the first part we covered the rebellions in Serbia and in Bulgaria, and most importantly the massacres that occurred, both of the Muslims and of the Christians, the volunteer detachments of Bashi Buzuks, who did most of the killing, and then the escalation of international tensions, first with the crisis in the summer of '76, the offensive against Serbia by the Ottomans, and finally we stopped at the international conference in Constantinople in December 1876. Here are the decisions. The decisions of the international conference in Constantinople are that Ottoman Empire should recognize the autonomy, and this is important, autonomy, not independence, autonomy. So complete self-rule of Bulgaria, Bosnia and Herzegovina. And they should stop their offensive against Serbia and declare truce, which means ceasefire. Now these are pretty lenient terms. They do not declare independence of these countries. But you know what? The Turks refuse. They refuse on the grounds that the Treaty of Paris, which is after the Crimean War, recognized territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire. So the Turks are saying, by the treaty that exists, you recognize territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire. How come now you want autonomy of these countries? Now, the answer basically is because there's trouble, because there's massacres, because we need to have peace in these areas. So that's why they refuse. Finally, the crisis goes on for 3 months, on the verge of not knowing whether there's going to be a war or not. And the Russians make one more last attempt at peace, which is March 31, 1877. And that is known as the London Convention, which is that the Russians invited the British to cooperate, and they issue a convention, which means a declaration, which demands of the Turks to recognize the autonomy of Christian lands. So in other words, it's a March 31 is the joint British-Russian declaration, which is known as the London Convention, which restates the conditions of the International Conference in Constantinople of December '76, which basically asks the Ottoman Empire one last time to grant self-rule and autonomy to Christian lands. Now that includes pretty much everybody. That includes Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, all of them. And of course Maronite Christians in Lebanon, they refuse. So once they refuse, it took 24 days for Russia to react after they refused. But on 24th of April, Russia declares war. They begin the preparations for a big 300,000 Russian army is assembled on the Danube, which is in today's Romania, Moldavia, and the second front is opened up in Armenia. Armenians are very, very happy about this because a part of Armenia was in the Russian Empire, but a big part of Armenia was in the Ottoman Empire, and now they feel this is their chance to liberate the rest of Armenia, which is that would have given the Armenians access to the Black Sea, which they didn't have, and they still don't to the present day, because these territories were taken over by the Ottoman Empire in World War I, and they kept them. But in that war, they do advance to Kars and Argadan and towards the Black Sea, which is very, very good for Armenia to have access to the sea. In any case, the Russians they begin their offensive, and the military situation is like this. There's two fronts in the Black Sea region, the Danube, and in the Armenian region. And the Turks have most of their fortifications along the Black Sea coast and the Danube River. This is where huge fortresses, and they have these fortifications and garrisons and guns, and it's like a big deal. But then the Russians decide to advance along the Danube further towards the mountains and cross the river there. It takes them several months to do that. But in the end they do, and they successfully cross under Count Gurko, who is Field Marshal Commander. They cross the Danube in June of, the beginning of the war is 77. June 77, and now it is almost a year later that they crossed the Danube in June 78. And this is the crucial point. Once they cross the Danube, which is a huge river, it's really wide. I mean, and they built pontoon bridges, something new that didn't exist in those days that easily. Pontoon bridges are the floating bridges. It takes quite an engineer feat to even now to bring the pontoon bridge so that an army could cross. In those days it was even more complicated, especially when you have fire on the other side of the river. But they do manage finally to build a pontoon bridge and to cross the river. Moreover, what's interesting is that the Tsar himself is with the troops, and I remember reading his wife keeps saying, "Oh, why it's so dangerous, why don't you come back to Petersburg, why don't you leave it to the generals to fight the war?" And he says, "No, it's my honor is at stake, I have to be with my army." So because people are dying, and there's tens of thousands of casualties by that time. The Tsarevich, which means the son of the Tsar, who is a future Emperor Alexander III, is there as well. And they keep on advancing. Two biggest fights were around the fortress of Pleven, or Plevna in Russian, and then finally they break through and they go to the mountain passes. Now, if you look at the geography of the Balkans, you have these plains from the Danube that climb up to the mountain range. Once you come to the mountain range, over the mountain range is Greece and the Aegean Sea. And the border today between Bulgaria and Greece is in that area of the mountains. But also, if you come to the mountains, then basically there is a slope going all the way down to Constantinople. In other words, if you take the mountain passes, your way is open to Greece and to Constantinople itself. So when the Russians take the mountain of Shipka, that is crucial. This is the turning point of the war, and the way is open all the way to Greece and to Constantinople. There's a monument to Russian soldiers in Shipka, and when I was this December 31, we had New Year's Eve in Sofia, Bulgaria, and I was amazed that the main street of Sofia is called To the Tsar Liberator, which is to Alexander II, and there are monuments to Russian generals all over Sofia. Even though Sofia today is the capital of a country that's members of NATO that are really quite hostile to Russia, nevertheless, there are monuments to Russian generals all over the place. And finally, this is at this moment when the British begin to be worried, and they think, wait a second, now the Russians may be winning, what can we do? And the Russian troops are continuing to fall down towards Constantinople from the Shipka mountain. And at one point, the Russian avant-garde troops come to about 50 kilometers from Constantinople. Now, this is, of course, a moment of great expectation for most Russians, because you have to understand that Hagia Sophia, for the Russians, is like Mecca for the Muslims. This is a cathedral that is the first great Christian church when Emperor Constantine proclaimed Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. That is it. You know, this is the most important church for Christians. There's one other one in Jerusalem which was built over the place where Jesus was crucified. But after the one in Jerusalem, that's the one that is important. And the Russian troops are 50 kilometers from it. And I read memoirs of some general who wrote, we should just keep on pushing. And then there comes the order of Emperor, the Tsar, the commander-in-chief, to stop. And one of the generals thought, we should pretend we didn't get it. Let's just move on. Let's just take Constantinople, and tomorrow we will say, sorry, we didn't get the telegram. So they were kind of like on the verge of just going out and smashing it and taking over. But it didn't. In the end, Russian troops stopped in San Stefano, which is a town, a few kilometers away from Constantinople, and they did not proceed. Why that? Is because the British issued an ultimatum to the Russians that if they do, the British would join the war on the side of the Turks. They didn't want Russians to get Constantinople because Constantinople controls the access from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. And the British certainly don't want Russians in the Mediterranean. They want to keep going over Egypt and the Suez Canal, and then they grabbed, in 1882, a few years after this war, they grabbed Sudan and they grabbed Cyprus. I mean, they wanted to have it all for themselves, not for the Russians. And the Russians didn't care about Mediterranean. They just wanted Constantinople. But the British think that everybody's after their Mediterranean and the trade routes. The Russians were not interested in trade routes. They wanted Hagia Sophia. But they didn't. In any case, the Russians stop, and then there is a treaty which is called San Stefano Treaty. And the San Stefano Treaty, Russia gets pretty much what it wanted: independence of Bulgaria, independence of Romania, independence of Serbia, independence of Montenegro. All of these countries get independent. Russia does expand its territory a little bit in Moldavia and in Armenia. So these are the results. But then the British sort of feel that the Russians got too much, and they insist that there should be a revision to the San Stefano Treaty. And for that purpose, they convene one more time the Concert of Europe, which is great powers, in Berlin in 1878. This is called as the Berlin Congress. So the Berlin Congress of 1878 is the assembly of great powers, including Bismarck of Germany. So Germany, Austria-Hungary, France, Britain, and Russia assembled to revise the Treaty of San Stefano. They revise it in ways that they do not limit independence of these countries, but they decide that Russia has too much power, and they decide to put as heads of state of these new countries German princes, so German dynasties, so that the West has more influence over it. And Alexander II kind of like agrees, which he shouldn't have. Russia won a clear victory, and it could have actually demanded Constantinople and a guarantee of not entering the Mediterranean. But anyway, he just kind of diplomatically they lost. The Russians won militarily, but lost diplomatically by agreeing to the revisions of the San Stefano Treaty. But you see, the reason this is so important, and I'm going to finish in a minute, is that San Stefano Treaty is the revisions of San Stefano Treaty in Berlin are very, very important, because up to this point there was a kind of a de facto alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia against the British and the French because of the Crimean War. The British and the French were an enemy for Russia because of the Crimean War, and they were still an enemy because they stopped Russian advance and they were prevented Russia from getting Constantinople. After the Berlin Congress, there's a beginning of a process of a Russian disillusionment with Germany because they put their princes in power in these countries, and there's a beginning to be of a rapprochement, as the French put it, or a reconciliation especially between France and Russia. And that reconciliation would lead to a historical event. In 1884, Russian Tsar Alexander II was killed by terrorists in 1880 2 years after the war. Yeah, he was blown up to pieces by Russian terrorists in St. Petersburg. When we go there next week, you're going to see a church which was built on the spot where Alexander II was killed by the terrorists. But in any case, 1884, Alexander III comes to Paris and signs a historic alliance with France. And if you come to Paris, you would see one of the most beautiful bridges leading from Place de la Concorde to the other side of Seine, and that bridge is called Pont de Alexandre de Troyes. Well, ask any Frenchman when you're in Paris, who is Alexander de Troyes? And they'll tell you, if they know, maybe they don't. That's a Russian Tsar. That's the Russian emperor who came, and in his honor, this bridge is called Alexander de Troyes. Any case, this is a hugely important. I told you in the beginning that war is crucial because it left a number of unresolved issues that would lead to World War I. So one consequence is that Russia and France are now allies. The British would actually join, and that will be called a triple entente between Russia, France, and Britain. And speaking of Constantinople, there's a secret protocol that if there is a war and if they win, which they did, but Russia had a revolution, it flipped out. Russia should have gotten Constantinople after World War I. If Russia had stayed in the alliance and the communist revolution threw all these plans off, but there is a secret protocol that as a reward for victory over Ottoman Empire and Germany, Russia would have received Constantinople, and then the emperor could have been crowned as the Byzantine emperor, and the church bells would have been ringing all over Russia, but didn't happen. Russia wasn't lucky to get that because of the communist revolution. In any case, this is the important consequence of this war. A second, of course, important consequence is that Germany would seek an alliance with the Ottoman Empire to oppose Russian influence and French influence in the Ottoman Empire. Basically, Ottoman Empire was lucky. It got away without losing Constantinople. And the third most important consequence is Bosnia-Herzegovina. As I told you before, the Austrians annexed it in 1912, and that made Russians furious that the temporary administration turned into annexation, and they said, never again will we allow the Austrians to do anything. And when the next crisis came, when Franz Ferdinand was killed by the Serbian terrorists, the Austrians issued an ultimatum to Serbia. The Russians said, no, we're going to support Serbia, and that led to World War I. And on that note, my dear boys and girls, tell all your friends to subscribe to Middle Eastern History with Dr. Brovkin.